Okay, the event this evening that we're about to participate in is a discussion of renewable energy future for New Zealand. And we know that there are lots of developments within the renewable energy field in terms of various technological developments. And there's also growing voices about some of the limitations of renewables. And it's obviously an issue that's important for us to understand as we make our transition away from fossil fuels. And so this event has been sponsored by the energy subgroup of the Nelson Tasman Climate Forum. And we're going to have three speakers. Peter Kemp, who is a member of that energy subgroup of the Climate Forum, is just going to give us a brief summary of a paper that's been written called Through the Eye of a Needle. And it has a longer title, but won't go through. Can everyone participating please mute their microphones at this stage so there's no interference for the person speaking, and there will be an opportunity after the speakers for Q&A. And I'll try to facilitate that. So Peter will give us a brief summary of the Eye of the Needle paper. And then Justin Hotchkiss, who is one of the co-directors of the McDermott Institute, will give us a more optimistic perspective on what the innovations in renewable technology can possibly do for us. And Nathan, I think, is likely to question the possibility of renewables actually replacing fossil fuels. So that's the overall agenda. We'll go through those three speakers, and then we will open it up to questions and answers. So Peter Kemp, if you would share your screen and proceed. You've got about five to 10 minutes max to do the summary.
Okay, thanks, Jack. Is that visible? Is my screen there visible?
Yep, very good.
Okay, so the Eye of the Needle paper, which prompted the event that we're at now, came out on the 26th of July from the University of British Columbia. And it appeared in a peer-reviewed journal called Energies at that time. So it's only 3 months old. So I think it'll still be fairly relevant given the pace of change. It may not be, but let's hope so. So William Rees is a Professor Emeritus at the University of British Columbia, has been doing energy planning and other kinds of planning for communities and regions since 1972. So he's a fairly heavyweight academic, and Megan Siebert is the director of the Real Green New Deal project in Vancouver. So the paper consists of a lot of research, and it gathers together a lot of research from other places to draw some conclusions about whether or not renewables, as we think of them today, are going to be a solution to our carbon woes. Okay. So the paper questions the Green New Deal narrative as we have been hearing it for quite a while now. The Green New Deal narrative goes something like, the renewable energy future will look just like the fossil fuel present, but simply electrified and decarbonized. Another way of saying that is that a smooth transition away from fossil fuels is a relatively simple technological matter. Well, in the investigation that Megan and William have done there, they come up with the idea that really this is a comforting narrative for business as usual by alternative means. So the paper examines all the current technologies that we're thinking of today: wind, solar, battery storage, wood gasification, hydrogen production and compression. What's that one? Is geothermal, then small nuclear modules being distributed around the planet on big trucks, natural gas upgrading, nuclear fission and fusion, large solar arrays heating up barrels of salt, occupying 5 square miles, charcoal from wood, pumped hydro or ordinary hydro, and biofuels in their various forms. So it goes through all of those current technologies and examines them, thinking of them on a global scale. Are they practical? Are they timely? Are they going to be adequate? Will they deliver? So some of the mathematical calculations that they do to estimate some of the quantities, and there are a lot of them in the paper, but to give a kind of overview or a sort of global idea of the kind of scale that we're thinking of on rolling out renewables to meet the anticipated primary energy demand in 2050, assuming 60% reductions of emissions from 2004 would take approximately 26,000 1 gigawatt nuclear power plants. That's the kind of statistic that they come up with in the paper. So that's a lot of nuclear power plants and gives a kind of idea of the scale when we're looking at if we're trying to do this with other kinds of renewables. So they look a lot at the supply chain issue, the resource availability, the mining required. I'm just going to the refining required, the manufacturing required, the transport and installation of all the different technologies. They look at these in great detail. They look at infrastructure questions. How are we going to distribute the electrification that's needed? Grid replacement. How are we going to store solar and wind energy and in a way that is not impossible? And then how are we going to replace infrastructure that is designed for fossil fuels? The ecological implications are also looked at. Waste streams are alarmingly large. Toxicity in manufacture is alarmingly large, and emissions from their manufacture are also considered. And then we have to consider the maintenance of the ecosphere, of course, when we're considering ecological implications. And well over half the ecosphere has to be maintained intact if we're going to have any kind of life, quality of life.
I think that.
And then the social implications are considered as well, social injustices, the exploitation which is likely to occur of third world countries and minority groups and refugees and small nations, and the costs, of course, are considered, the costs of all the above. And then how sustainable they are given energy descent and self-sufficiency. Do they produce enough energy to rebuild themselves from the ground up, as well as provide a little bit more for the use of humankind? So the conclusions the paper comes to are that, in fact, the technologies are non-renewable, some more than others. They're not self-sufficient. They're fossil energy intensive. Egregious social justices are likely to occur. There is significant environmental degradation involved in manufacture and installation and maintenance, and that they're prohibitively expensive. Okay. So that's a summary without any detail of the conclusions of the paper and the criteria that the paper is based on.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Peter. Now, Justin, we'll turn it over to you for a something completely different, as Monty Python used to say, and from that perspective. So over to you, Justin, if you could take control of the screen and unmute yourself.
All right, is that coming through?
It is, yes.
Yep. All right, kia ora koutou. Thanks everyone. Thanks for having me here. So yeah, the messages that I took from this paper were that the authors, as Peter has just summarized, they really highlight many mostly material sustainability as well as other kind of ethical issues with current renewable technologies. And they do highlight the fact that they're not truly renewable. But the other message that I took from the paper, which is, I guess, the part that Peter didn't get to in his summary, was their proposed alternative. And in my mind, it's quite an extreme alternative, which is basically to retreat to a one-child policy globally to get down to 1 billion population and retreat to a small economy. If that's the alternative, then I think we need to weigh up our options against that. So I'll be presenting, actually, I'll just summarize a few of the issues that I certainly acknowledge that they lay out here with current renewable technologies and electrification in general. So, you know, process heat for industry, let's say in the New Zealand case, that would be drying milk powder, that kind of thing. That requires fossil fuels, as we know. Solar PVs, for example, they require a lot of energy to make, and they only have a 20 to 30 year lifespan. So that's a lot of e-waste at the end if it can't be recycled, and they have a lot of, you know, metal dopants and things like that. Batteries don't store energy for all that long, and they also require a lot of mineral extraction, lithium, significantly. Wind turbines, again, lots of metal, lots of steel, lots of concrete, heavy duty machinery to install and just to keep this industry going. These are all big problems. Carbon capture, the technologies themselves can emit carbon, and, you know, there's still a problem of how to actually sequester the carbon. And then the authors also talk about biofuels and, you know, taking away from food. So these really are all problems that are, you know, the authors are correct to highlight. But I guess my take on this is that, you know, do we really want to throw the baby out with the bathwater? Because basically, you know, if we're to follow the proposed approach, which is to institute a one-child policy globally, get down to 1 billion people by the end of the century, and then, you know, rebuild with much lower expectations about, you know, economic standards of living, etc. Even that, you know, notwithstanding the moral and political problems with that approach, that's still going to take a lot of carbon to get there. You know, there's still quite a transition period, and other resources as well as carbon emissions. So if we acknowledge that there must be a transition, then are we not better at using that transition period to develop truly sustainable renewable technologies? and iron out the issues and the imperfections with the kind of first generation renewable technologies. And I guess what I would like to get across this evening is that this is actually starting to happen anyway. And there's a lot of innovative products and new business models that are coming up, especially and including in New Zealand. And I want to share some of these today. And it's not just the science, but it's the maturity of a deep tech investment sector that's actually, putting money into the right areas. So this picture here of a horse and cart is to remind us of the so-called horse manure crisis. And this was apparently, I'm sure it's been embellished, but apparently in 1894, there was an article in the Times of London that was claiming that within 50 years, the streets of London would be 9 feet deep in horse manure. And it was basically extrapolating, the horse manure from horse-drawn carriages and, looking at the growth in the number of horse-drawn carriages and then suggesting that it will take more horses to remove the manure and it will just keep getting worse and worse. And it was seen as an intractable problem, which was, of course, a moot problem as soon as internal combustion cars arrived, and there were no longer horses on the street. And I guess the point of this story, which is widely used kind of analogy, is that there are some problems that seem impossible until new things come along, until there are paradigm shifts. So I think the paradigm shift that's relevant for us here is around the circular economy, and in particular, the circular economy for materials. And I think really one of the key problems that the authors lay out in the paper is that of a kind of a linear economic model around taking resources from the earth, using them and disposing them, basically. And a circular economy, as well as, recycling, refurbishing, there's a lot of effort into whether it's on the kind of biological side or on the kind of hard tech material side. Almost everything should be able to be broken down and oops, sorry, I just got distracted by a question and went forward. Here we go. We should be able to recover value from the waste, and therefore there will be not a lot of waste, and we'll be able to reuse things instead of throwing them out. And I'll give you some examples of that and how these are being commercialized now. And it's not just about reusing and recycling, it's actually getting back things in the chemical sense. So the first example of that I'll give is a New Zealand company, a startup company up in Auckland called Mint Innovation. And they're a startup company, been around for, 5 years or so. And they're doing very, very well. And as you can see in the top line here, they're all about urban mining. And I've got a video here, which I'm going to see if I can play it. Okay, I'll stop that there. So that's what they mean by urban mining. So this, in this case, this is not really a renewables example, but it does really well illustrate the point of the circular economy applied to materials. And so the point is that in e-waste from computers and other electronic materials that we throw out, there's actually a higher concentration of gold than you would get in gold ore when you're mining it. And they've developed a process, this urban mining process, to recover all that gold, and they're looking for other precious metals in other waste. So you can see the relevance of that to some of the problems that they set out in this Eye of the Needle paper. So the next example, I'm going to run through quite a few examples of, in my mind, quite exciting things happening, a lot of them in New Zealand, in the circular economy. So this is another one, Zincovery. Similar idea, basically extracting, in this case, zinc from galvanizing waste. So right now, galvanizing acid waste is disposed of, and it costs money, and it costs environmental impact to dispose of it. And so the team behind Zincovery have developed the process to basically recover the zinc, the iron oxide, and get fresh acid to be used again. So it closes the cycle. And so they, the business model is that they instead of people paying to dispose of their waste, they pay these people to dispose of the waste, and they get valuable metals back out of it. Avatana is another company based out of Auckland. Similar idea. They've developed chemical processes for extracting commodity chemicals out of waste streams, and so this is avoiding the need to mine more materials. There was a lot of detail in the paper about, for example, the carbon emissions from steel, and wind turbines, for example, take a lot of steel, a lot of concrete, both of which emit a huge amount of CO2. In fact, the steel industry is the biggest single source of CO2 emissions as an industry globally. And so I just wanted to highlight this alternative, which is being developed in New Zealand by my colleague Chris Bumby, and that's to replace the coal in steelmaking. So in steelmaking, currently coal is used both as a heat source as well as a chemical reductant to take the oxidized iron down to reduced form of iron metal. And so the alternative process, which is working in a lab scale already, is to use hydrogen, and that would be green hydrogen generated from renewable electricity mixed with iron oxide to generate metallic iron. Or there's, this is another company that I am involved with, Cirrus Material Science, based in Auckland. And they're all about smart chemical processes to basically use less materials to make high performance things and make them last longer. So that's another aspect of material science for sustainability. Or on the biological side, this group is looking at using forest products, using trees, not just for building and logs and paper, but basically for bioplastics, biochemicals, everything that we currently get from fossil fuels, carbon-based things. We can develop the chemistry to do that from trees. Humblebee is a kind of high performance bioplastics that's so this is a Wellington-based company making high performance bioplastics based on some secrets that have been uncovered from this very rare type of bee that creates this very strong resin. This is a membrane filter for CO2 that my colleague Shane Telfer has been making, and it uses a porous molecular crystal called a metal organic framework, which has got pores that are kind of the size of molecules, and it can selectively absorb CO2 and let everything else through, or you can make it, you can tune the molecular cavities to soak up whatever you want. And so with membranes like this, we can potentially soak up CO2 from the air, and then we can do chemistry to turn that CO2 into something else. So it's not just a case of pumping it into the ground. We could actually turn it into polymers, we could turn it into fuels or something like that. And this is actually a really huge area of chemistry right now. So these are just a couple of papers, and I could have chosen thousands of papers in the last year or two that are about CO2 conversion chemistry. So the top one published in Nature a few years ago by a friend of mine in Stanford discovered some entirely novel types of reactions based on CO2. So if we can capture the CO2, their whole thing was that we can use these new reactions to actually make commodity chemicals and replace fossil fuels in the chemical and material industry. And this bottom paper is a review of different research on taking CO2 and chemically reducing it into more useful building blocks to do other things with. So I guess the point here is that CO2 doesn't need to be always seen as our enemy. We can actually, just like I was talking about with the other circular economy examples, we can actually develop smart chemistry to extract value from CO2 by converting it into other things that don't go into the atmosphere. So I just want to give a bit of a glimpse. So that I guess what I was talking about up till now is kind of the circular economy and the chemistry aspects of the circular economy, where we can recover things rather than disposing of them, and extract value from them, as well as save on disposing things into the environment. So we just have a quick look at some of tomorrow's renewable energy technologies. This is something that I'm working on. These are flexible printed solar photovoltaic cells. They're not made of silicon, they're made of organic molecules and polymers. And the active layers are only about 100 nanometers thick. So that means that you only need about 5 grams of the material to cover a square meter. And they could ultimately be derived from carbon that is extracted from the atmosphere or some kind of emission source using the chemistry that I described a couple of slides ago. So these things work, and they're about 3/4 of the efficiency of a silicon photovoltaic cell, and it's really just about scaling up the manufacturing for these to be feasible. So we know that in electric vehicles and a lot of other kind of electric transport and things, it's all about lithium ion batteries. And there's a lot of concern about lithium ion batteries, partly because of the lithium and partly because of the graphite that is actually a decent fraction of the weight of lithium ion batteries. Graphite mining is not very sustainable. And this New Zealand company, Carbonscape, has developed a process to make graphite directly from biological sources. So they've got a process for sustainable graphite for directly targeting that battery industry. There was a paper that came out a couple of months ago, and this article refers to that paper, and this is just from it's just from a couple of weeks ago, and it's talking about some membranes that were discovered by a team of chemists to extract lithium from seawater. So lithium is in seawater, it's very dilute, but we can use these membranes to concentrate lithium rather than mining it. Or we can do without lithium entirely. So this is my colleague Shalini Devya, who's the CEO of a startup company that's just getting off the ground now called Tasman Iron in Wellington. And their technology is aluminium ion batteries. So it's basically a battery that replaces the lithium with aluminium. And in doing so, it replaces some of the other components of the battery as well into more sustainable and safer alternatives. There's also, you can also kind of go to the low-tech side on batteries. So this is a picture of some flow batteries where the instead of having an anode and a cathode that might be solid state in the case of lithium ion batteries. So those are the kind of high performance, high power batteries. But if we're just using batteries for kind of grid scale electricity, you know, let's say to balance fluctuations from renewables or whatever, we can use so-called flow batteries where we store the energy in a big, you know, container of analyte and catholyte. So these are dissolved, ideally in water, and these two solutions meet each other across a membrane, and you get electricity out. So this is actually more like the very first kind of galvanic cells invented as batteries, where things are flowing, and they're very, very simple and very scalable. You can scale them, you know, as long as it's, you know, you're not going to carry this around in your car, but if it's just somewhere at a power grid substation, you can certainly pack in a lot of power. So that's these kind of flow batteries, and of course the analyte and catholyte can be made to be, you know, very abundant and safe materials. This is something that has a role in a renewable grid. This I just saw today. This is my colleague, Sally Brooker, and she's spearheading a partnership between New Zealand and Germany around green hydrogen. So the Germans are really keen to invest in the green hydrogen industry, particularly in Southland. You know, you may have heard about a pilot plant being put out for tender in Southland, where there's a lot of green electricity. And so there's a lot of potential for using some of that green electricity to make green hydrogen and developing an industry around hydrogen, whether it be to make green steel, or I've got another example about what you might do with green hydrogen shortly. Right here, in fact, and this is a company that's about to formally spin out from another colleague of mine, Frank Natalie, and it's around an ambient process for making ammonia. So nitrogen plus hydrogen equals ammonia, and if you go the other way, you get so ammonia is a good way of storing, is a good liquid way of storing hydrogen. And so it's thought of as a really useful fuel hydrogen carrier for things like shipping, because it's got a very high energy density. And so as long as you're, so that this company, Liquium, they've developed a very good catalyst for doing that. You might also do it for fertilizer. And currently that takes a lot of process heat. You need to heat things up to very high temperatures and high pressures. And this is the, I always get mixed up between these two catalytic processes, either the Haber-Bosch or the other one that I forget. But, you know, a process that's been around for, you know, over 100 years in industry, and they've developed a new catalyst to do it at room temperature. So I guess my point, and, you know, this is a lot of examples that I've given you here, that they can be win-win. These are, you know, most of the examples I've given are actually startup companies that investors have got behind, that there's a business model, that there are environmental and economic benefits from pursuing these technologies. You know, the whole motivation to do this work is an acknowledgement of the types of problems that the authors of the Eye of the Needle paper set out, problems with current renewable technologies. So just to finish up, I want to say a few things about just the, you know, what's beyond the science, the technical side of things, what's happening more in the finance and the business side. One thing is that there's been massive divestment from fossil fuels, which is a good thing. So, retirement funds, just, the biggest funds in the world with billions or collectively trillions of dollars have just said, we're not putting any of our money into any industries that support fossil fuels. And that basically just dries up the capital for the fossil fuel industry. And of course, that money has been shifted into green investment funds that are actively seeking to stimulate growth of renewable or of sustainable technologies. So, for example, a new venture capital fund in New Zealand, the Climate Venture Capital Fund, is explicitly hoping to invest in these type of technologies. But I have to say that the other venture capital funds in New Zealand that are investing in deep tech, for example, a lot of the companies that I've shown, there's a growing number of venture capital funds, and without being called the Climate Venture Capital Fund, they really are going for sustainability and climate tech, because venture capital funds are betting on things that are going to make a big difference in the future, and that's where they're putting their money. So if you look at funds like Sir Stephen Tyndall's K1W1 and many other venture capital funds in New Zealand, they're really backing this in a big way. Or there's a startup company called Toha, which is they're kind of trying to build a marketplace that is accounting for the environmental impact, so people will kind of get proper credit for doing positive things for the environment. And this is a company that's one of the co-founders is Professor Sean Hendy, who's you probably see on the news every day because he's doing all the COVID modeling right now, which is distracting him a little bit from this. But this is a kind of a impact investment type of framework that they're trying to develop here. And this is, for the kind of mum and dad investors, this is just a screenshot from a few different categories in Sharesies. So these are just, these aren't even individual companies. These are just ETFs, which are, essentially just indexed funds. And these are all ETFs that you can invest in, at the click of a button on Sharesies, that are in clean energy, in carbon and climate, or in sustainability, in water and things like that. So there's, I guess my point is that there's a lot of capital flowing away from fossil fuels and towards sustainability and kind of growing and stimulating the types of technologies that I talked about earlier. I guess the main point of the paper, it's got a lot of truth to it, and it's about environmental overshoot, and it really reminded me of this book Donut Economics by Kate Raworth of Oxford. And this is basically the figure, the key idea in Kate's book was that it's, right now in our economic thinking is around, extracting resources for endless growth. And what donut economics talks about is that we need to be in this green zone, this donut, where we're below the ecological ceiling. We're not overshooting. We're within the limits of what the planet can sustain, and we're meeting our social needs. We've got enough water and food and for everyone, and there's social equity, housing, etc. So success is about finding that green zone, not about how much we can grow. So I think that the basic message of the paper along these lines, I agree with, but I just have a more optimistic take that we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. These sustainability issues with renewable technologies are certainly real, and the technical solutions are coming, and there's a lot of incentive to get them. I agree that it's not a technical, it's not just a technical problem. And, you know, this is the point that they make. We can't just say that it's solved just because there's a technical solution. But there are also economic incentives and, you know, investment structures that can be aligned with environmental sustainability, particularly in a circular economy approach, where you can both, you know, save money and save environmental costs from disposal, as well as recovering something of value. So this is something that, you know, I think is going to put a totally different framing of the whole problem. So I think, yeah, that's my last slide. I will stop sharing now and turn over to Nathan.
That's great. Thank you, Justin. That's a very impressive set of initiatives that it's helpful to understand. We'll go to Nathan, and then we'll open it up to questions. So Nathan, are you in a position to screen share and take control of the screen?
Firstly, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, I'm just about to share my screen. Oh, 1 second. Sorry, get there in a second. Nah, come on. There we go. Can you see?
There you go.
Excellent. Okay.
Got it.
So, firstly, thank you, Justin, for your presentation. A bit of a sort of tour de force through the Bright Green Greatest Hits album, and I'm going to attempt in this talk to give a little bit of a dissenting view on that bright green future that we are told we should be aiming towards. And my dissension is based on a variety of observations, primarily contained within the paper that we're considering, the Through the Eye of the Needle paper, but also I've dragged in some other resources and references just to try and make that a little bit more relevant to some of the things we're discussing now. I've just lost my presenter view here. 1 second, I'm just trying to find my notes. No, it's not going to do that. Okay, all right. As long as you can see that, and I can go like that and go on to the next bit. Yeah, excellent. All right. So actually, before I do that, just very quickly, I'm a professional engineer. Actually, I was a chartered professional engineer between 2009 and 16. My interests and activities have diversified, and I wasn't practicing enough to maintain my chartered registration. So I dropped the chartered title, and I've chosen to take up the title recovering engineer, professional engineer, or sometimes transition engineer instead. I spent a decade in the UK designing building energy systems, primarily on the mechanical side, and that energy systems perspective from the sort of implementation side of things led me to a wider understanding of energy systems, and ultimately to the broader understanding, which I now feel confident to talk about in public, regarding some of the constraints on potential futures that I talked about, and some of the ways in which we need to adjust our expectations. So I've titled this talk, subtitle there, Flaws in the Assumptions Behind the Bright Green Future. And the bright green being that Green New Deal, transition to something like our current economy, something like our current population, etc., but with renewable, or as Justin put out, not really renewable, in fact, rebuildable might be a better word, as Nate Higgins has observed, technologies. So the bright green perspective often makes statements such as this. So solar PVs, wind turbines, batteries, electric vehicles, fast cooling, renewable fuels, fertilizers, waste, even computers and data centers. These are areas where substantial innovation may get us a long way to a sustainable future. for this to happen, we need to create new materials. So that's the sort of bright green statement that you come across on the internet, and underlying assumptions behind this type of statement, and also with sub-points here, the references for the counterpoint that I'll go through, and I've just picked 3. Keep this talk short. Please do give me a 5-minute prompt, Jack, if you can. Energy costs have been accepted as externalized costs. Siebert and Rees speak to this in chapter 2 of their paper, Climate Change in the Context of Overshoot. The renewable energy technologies are able to support the transition in a meaningful way. And Siebert and Rees talk to this in section 3, and specifically 3.1, the electrification question, which Justin spoke to briefly. And then humans are capable of making better choices. We just need to give them better information and technological choices. And I've chosen a separate reference for this. Nate Hagens and DJ White wrote a book recently called Reality Blind, and chapter 3 of this book gives some of the understanding from current psychological science, looking at what are the those are things which very much are relevant to the discussion that we're having tonight. So on the externalities question, in the paper, and I've gone to a couple of Bill Rees's talks, in all my slides you'll see down on the bottom right the link to the specific reference that I've dragged this screenshot from. In this case, it's a presentation by Bill Rees from about a year ago, summarizing what he put into the paper, which is that 10,000 years ago, humans were 1% of mammalian biomass, and the other 99% was wild animals. Fast forward to today, we have 32% of mammalian biomass is humans, 67% is our livestock, and 1% are wild animals. Other externalities, other birds and populations of species populations that are declining. Wild bird populations are tumbling, and domestic poultry is now estimated at around 70% of the total avian biomass. Average populations of thousands of monitored species of wild vertebrates have declined by at least 60% since 1970. Populations of invertebrates, including essential pollinators, are also in free fall. Butterflies down 53%, beetles down 49%, bumblebees down 46%. And given these facts, the question I'm asking here is, do we think that the pursuit of better renewable technologies that could extend the lifespan of this ecocidal industrial civilization, thus increasing this imbalance, is in any way sapient or wise? So that's just a brief note on externalities. I'm going to speak now to something I'm far more familiar with, which is the energy situation. I've got about 6 slides on this, and this will help just to give you a bit of context to some of the conclusions I draw, so which support the paper. In New Zealand, we have this narrative that we are, aiming towards 100% renewable energy generation over the next few years, that we are able to make that transition in a relatively cost-effective way. There's a whole load of geothermal that's already consented and just isn't being built because there isn't the price to support it, and so on and so forth. I point here to the fact that actually electrical generation is 370 petajoules of the 950 total from this 2017 Sankey diagram showing the flow of energy through the economy. Petroleum down the bottom here is another 360, so the same again as electrical generation, and then biomass contribution, coal and natural gas is the remainder. So we have this situation where we're talking about 75% of a third of our total primary energy is generated by renewables. So 3/4 of 1/3 by my reckoning is 3/12 roughly. So the other 9/12 roughly, is that right? Is from these other sources, and to shift that, we would have to, if we were going to electrify, triple our electrical generation capacity, for example. and there's questions about how much the electricity can do things like produce high temperature inputs for industrial uses and so on. So that's just a bit of an overview of New Zealand, the scale of the challenge. I want to talk about oil supply. Now, oil is, in many respects, the master resource when it comes to industrial economy. Everything we do relies on oil supply in the industrial economy, and diesel in particular is the lifeblood of that. So just a bit of a historical perspective on where we are currently. And this is going back 100 years, basically, to 1920. And we see in this graphic the bars representing discoveries. And so, for example, Gawar in Saudi Arabia, this huge spike here. But you can see a general trend down in this direction. At the same time, the production, so the actual supply of oil, has trended up in that manner there. And if we look at this square down here, and what we see is this is the last few years, so 2013, 14, up to 2019. And again, if we look at the average production for the year, average discoveries for the year, we can see there is this definite trend over the last 7 years in a downwards direction. So the record low in discoveries in 2017 actually hadn't been rivaled since back in the 1920s. So looking at the figures here, this is million barrels of oil, that's gigabarrels. So we're down at this sort of level. So basically what we're saying here is that this last few years, we're trending back down towards these sorts of levels right at the start of the period. And this is in a period when in the, say, 15 years to about 2015, the oil and gas companies were increasing their budgets for exploration and production efforts by 20% year on year for most of that period, until the shareholders really started to get upset. Where are our returns? And over the last 5 years or so, those investments have significantly dropped off. Now, 81% of the existing producing fields are in decline, and that was a 2016 statement. And of the top 10 modern producing fields, the youngest was discovered in 1976, and that's Hirsch 2011. So we are not discovering enough new oil to support demand growth, because the supply is the thing that's challenged by this lack of discoveries. And how fast can we expect the situation to change? This is a graphic from an analysis done by Professor Susan Crumdike, formerly of Canterbury University, just lost her to the UK, unfortunately. She's now in Edinburgh, but this is a analysis that she did in around about 2007, it looks like here, looking at the historic production, and this is global production. So this is aggregating studies from a wide variety of industry and academic sources, and looking at the statistical probability that our supply efforts will continue in these curves here. So they assessed a 50-50 chance that we'd peak our supply somewhere around what's that, 2013, 2014. Actually, we've continued to see a growth in supply up to 2020, roughly 2019, 2020. So we probably somewhere, have managed a supply which, in terms of the probability of us achieving it, was something like a 10% probability. So we can pat ourselves on the back there in one sense, and we've done quite well with that. It shows the ingenuity of engineers. However, and this is a quote. Oh, no, sorry, this is me. Once energy becomes more expensive, the economics of all the other raw materials will change. So there's a lot of talk about the continuing drop in the price of solar, etc., because diesel and oil, in a general sense, are the lifeblood of the industrial economy. As prices for production of those things, and we'll come back to this in a minute, go up, then the other raw materials prices, which have as inputs diesel, gas, etc., go up as well. And we can see this we are really witnessing this in real time globally at the moment, and I've chosen here just a brief example of urea, where high gas prices have led to production being uneconomic in Europe. So urea plants have shut down. A direct effect of that is likely to be lower agricultural yields within a couple of years. And there was also this indirect intermediate effect of CO2 shortages for fizzy drinks and food transportation and so on. That's pure CO2, obviously, in the industrial sense, rather than the stuff in the atmosphere. And as fast as existing supply is starting to deplete, what's more concerning from my perspective is this story around net energy and the net energy cliff. And so total energy in the economy, there's a fair bit of it goes to capital to get energy and energy to get energy. And over time, what we're seeing is this trend whereby the energy to get energy goes up. So we picked the low-hanging fruit first. We picked, you know, the Gawar fields back in the earlier part of the last century. Even in the 1970s, we still had a net energy ratio of 25 to 1. That's to say, for every 1 unit you put into producing it, you get 25 units back. Still pretty good. And we've assessed our wind and solar initiatives to be somewhere around that, which on the face of it sounds like good news. Oil in 1990, we're probably somewhere around 10 to 1 to 18 to 1. Oil today, because we're looking at things like biodiesel, like methanol, like tar sands and oil shale production, and even things like biomass-derived ethanol from, say, corn. Or hydrogen, and you'll notice here hydrogen's kind of gone off the graph. It's below 1. That is to say, and this is a statement that's backed up by some references I have at the end of the presentation, that it takes more energy to produce the hydrogen than you get from using it, and that's both in the costs of splitting the hydrogen away from whatever it's attached itself to. It's a very reactive molecule, and then also in the inefficiencies in the use of that in the storage and use of that hydrogen. So yeah, that's a little bit about the net energy cliff. So really what we're seeing is we're generally going for stuff down here when we're trying to stick with fossil fuels. Yes, wind and solar are higher, but one of the other problems that we have is that, and this in this chart here, you can see part A, past the dotted line here, is what's commonly talked about, which is the costs of construction of the wind turbine, say, or solar panel. That's an energy cost prior to it starting to generate energy. It then starts to generate energy, of which there's a self-consumption or inefficiency, and then there's the energy to the consumer. That's the stuff that we're actually going to use. There's the end of life and decommissioning. And when we look at the, just going back a slide for a second, when we look at the analyses that show solar PV and wind up at this part of the scale, you know, quite high energy return on investments or net energy ratios, then what we're seeing is an analysis that is part A of this chart only. That is to say, it includes everything from the start of the production of the actual machine to the end generation, but it misses this pre-existing energy costs, which we've already got a lot of sunken energy costs in existing infrastructure to have an energy system up and running. And just to give you an example that Justin mentioned, CCS, carbon capture and storage, that's something which has really no existing infrastructure. We have the existing oil and gas infrastructure that's causing the problem. And when you actually start to do the numbers on CCS infrastructure, this pre-existing bit, before you start constructing the CCS plants, which reduce the efficiency of the energy generation plants they're attached to, then actually what you get is this huge upfront cost. And to give you an idea of the scale, if we were to successfully sequester all of the carbon from all of the coal-fired plants that are currently in existence, not future, then the scale of the infrastructure in terms of the compressing, storage, pipelines, and disposal into these geologically stable formations, which we're mythically supposed to store it in, is about the same scale as the entire global oil industry infrastructure. So you can see there's quite a significant cost with a lot of these sort of solutions that are proffered and relied on by policymakers when it comes to things like making promises about how much carbon we're going to save in the latter half of the century. So there's a quote here that says, in short, no renewable energy source or system is viable if it cannot generate sufficient energy both to produce itself, literally from the ground up, and also supply a sufficient surplus for society's end-use consumption. And that end-use consumption is the key here, because it's no use generating the energy if you can't manufacture the goods and maintain complexity that demands the services that are associated with actually running a technological industrial society. And in that sense, currently no so-called renewable energy technology is actually in the running, unfortunately. So what this all means, oil as an industrial energy source is probably about to become unreliable because of the the resource depletion side of things. The after oil plan is needed now. The required extra capacity in the electrical power grid to charge the needed batteries just to replace the existing ICE transport fleet is much larger than current thinking allows for. Current solution of lithium-ion battery technology is not viable for a whole load of reasons, which we'll hopefully get to in the Q&A. Current global reserves of lithium, nickel, and cobalt are not enough to make the needed batteries to replace the existing ICE transport fleet, which Justin acknowledged. There's not enough time, and this is a really key one, to explore for more deposit on the scale needed, even if it were possible to do so. It will be required to find a new technology that is supported by different raw materials. And again, Justin's work is attempting to bridge that gap. And in 2005, the industrial ecosystem changed. That was around the time that the peak in conventional oil occurred. All the unconventional sources have kept the total supply going up to about 2019, when there was a peak in all liquid supply, which is now thought to be fairly permanent and is in the process of transforming into something else. So the industrial ecosystem is transforming. We can see that transformation occurring today, as I said, in real time, with the shortages of materials that are developing as a result of logistics issues related to COVID. But, if we had a robust, resilient global industrial system, then something like the pandemic shouldn't be able to cause the level of disruption that we're seeing. And could we please have a sensible conversation about this? I stole several of these slides, and you'll see the links down the bottom here from a presentation from Simon Michau. He's a geologist working with the Geological Survey of Finland, and I'm a Wise Response Committee member, and we had a recent presentation where Simon spoke to some of these issues as well. In the sense of, can we have a sensible conversation about this, I'd like to turn to some quotes from psychology or observations, I guess, about society in general. The masses have never thirsted after truth. They turn aside for evidence that is not to taste, preferring to deify error. Error seduces them. And who can supply them with illusions is easily their master. Whoever attempts to destroy their illusions is always their victim. So please don't shoot the messenger. Wooden-headedness plays a remarkably large role in governance. It consists in assessing a situation in terms of preconceived fixed notions, ideology, whilst ignoring any contrary signs. And the ideology, the civic religion of economics, and particularly the neoliberal, neoclassical perspective on how the economy should function, which is based on a whole load of abstractions, which again we can possibly get into in the Q&A, is something that's very interesting. It's acting according to wish, whilst not allowing oneself to be deflected by the facts. I mentioned Reality Blind, which is a very interesting book. A couple of observations from there. For society, knowledge of whence we came informs why we are ill-equipped to recognize and respond to the challenges of exceeding our limits. Addiction to fossil fuels, steep discount rates, myriad cognitive biases, delusionality, social conformity, etc., all combine to form a deep moat surrounding the castle of sustainable futures. In the same way our culture has grasped the logic to the paleo diet, where our brains gravitate towards sweet, salty, and fat items because they were important to our ancestors, maybe we should visualize a paleo behavioral diet, recognizing that many of our mental cravings, reactions, and responses are a product of our evolutionary past and are not healthy or productive in our current environment. Again, from Reality Blind, knowledge of evolved group and individual behavioral tendencies can give sound insights into how people, demographics, and whole countries are likely to respond to events in coming years and decades. And we live on a planet with a ginormous fossil sunlight endowment, which is about to decline in terms of its supply to us. And the next section of the book speaks to that. Complex gadgetry and electronic media honed to react to our ancestral impulses. And knowing our evolved psychology can help us make good predictions. Now, I'd love to spend several hours just on this part. The book has a whole chapter on it, chapter 3. The book is freely available at that link there. And there's also a YouTube presentation of about 3 hours by Nate Hagens, where he goes through some of this stuff. So please do have a look at that. I'm going to finish on this. We have a simplified reality that we can think about. The curve that needs flattening, and again, this is stolen from Bill Rees, a presentation called Climate Change Isn't the Problem, So What Is, where he charts population and consumption against the time. And there's the carrying capacity. There's this idea of one planet limit living that we're aiming for. The loss of carrying capacity from overshoot. So we've overshot, and what that's doing is degrading the capacity of the planet to actually support us. So actually one planet living now is down here, not up here. The one planet is the one sort of undisturbed planet that we started with, pre-industrial revolution. And actually what we're seeing is we are in overshoot, and we will see a level of systems collapse. And this is from the conclusion to the Eye of the Needle paper. I thought it summed it up reasonably well. To adopt a biblical metaphor, it may be very easy, it may very well be easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for humanity to shift its prevailing paradigm and embark on a planned voluntary descent from a state of overshoot to a steady state harmonic relationship with the ecosphere. And remembering this is in just a decade or two. On the other hand, history shows that virtually all important achievements have only ever arisen from a dogged pursuit of the seeming impossible. And to contemplate the alternative is unthinkable, which I think ends about where Justin started in terms of thinking about the proposed alternatives and effectively saying that there is no alternative. Now, I think where I'll finish is by saying that we are not gods on this planet. We are just clever apes, and it's really simply a case that we have the ability to temporarily circumvent physical limits because of the one-time inheritance of fossil fuels that's allowed us to harness energy and to have in effect hundreds of energy slaves working for us. But actually those slaves are in the process of being exhausted, and actually the future is one where we go back to relying on just flows of solar energy, and no doubt we'll have a talk about that in the question and answer as well. I think I'll leave it at that. Hopefully that wasn't too far over my time, and open it up to Q&A. I will say just quickly, I've got some references in here, references from all of the people I've included, and then in the appendices, there's some stuff actually on circular economy and hydrogen, and some stuff on futures and so on and so forth, which hopefully we might come back to as part of the Q&A. But anyway, thank you very much for listening, and hopefully that is a reasonable summary of some of the concerns about this idea of a bright clean future and some of the objections to it.
Oh, thank you, Nathan, and thank you to all of the speakers for pretty much keeping into the time allotments and for presenting very cogent positions. We'll get to questions, and I'd like to start the questions off by trying to bring these different perspectives together. And a question I'd like to address to Justin. You presented a very exciting range of innovative technologies that can make a difference. And two of the other speakers have spoken to the issue of scale, the magnitude of the scale and change and transition and the sort of timing requirements. Are you aware of, assuming that all of the examples you gave, and I assume that there are likely to be many more such innovations that you didn't have time to present, assuming that all of them can do what they state that they're aiming for, that they can do. Are there any simulations of what a national energy system based on these innovations would actually scale up to? What would their net energy yield be? Are there any simulations providing that? We have several scenarios, looking at the existing renewable technologies and what their net energy impacts might be. Are there any similar simulations that you're aware of that can help inform us whether the sort of innovations that you're talking about, assuming that they're valid, can in fact scale up in sufficient time?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the one I'm most familiar with is the kind of next generation of solar photovoltaics, and there are a number of companies that are actually scaling up the manufacture for them now, and they can be manufactured, roll to roll very quickly, and they don't require a lot of material. But right now they don't have sufficient kind of performance and demand to displace silicon photovoltaics. So I don't know of any kind of technical reasons why they couldn't meet that scale, but right now they're being marketed in kind of niche applications, like, things where lightweight and flexible, you can do different things that you can't do with existing silicon technologies. I guess to your main question, I mean, the most reliable simulations and modeling that you'll see, it needs to get input parameters, like from the Climate Change Commission modeling, for example. They need to use input parameters that are measured from technologies that are kind of used at scale. So, and that just doesn't exist for a lot of the emerging things that I've spoken about, just because it's too early to get the input to really model the scale.
Okay, thank you. Nathan, would you like to comment on the same question? I mean, again, you're coming from a different perspective, but I was curious as to what observations or perspectives you might contribute to the same question.
Yeah, could you just quickly repeat the question? Because
the question is basically assuming that all of the examples and many more that Justin has given of innovative technologies and their increased efficiencies, if given the scale of the transition that's required and the time scale that we have, well, I mean, the question I asked Justin was, are there any simulations that give us some sense of what the net energy might be of such a suite of innovations?
Right.
Is there any reason to believe it's feasible, or any reasons to believe it's not feasible?
I think the short answer, I'll try and keep it short, is that we really don't know. We have a very clear sense that renewable energy has a lower net energy ratio than rebuildable energy, I'm going to start calling it. There's a low net energy ratio than the fossil fuel alternatives have offered us historically, and it's that historical net energy that we've built our global industrial infrastructure on. If we're talking about a transition to another to a post-industrial, post-carbon future, but maintaining an industrial economy, then this likely to be something of the same order of magnitude as the one that created the systems that we have, right? And you have to ask, if we're going to do that, then where's that energy going to come from? And if you're going to do it in the time scales involved, then where it has to come from is existing energy sources. So what we start getting into at that point is this trade-off between, okay, these are the things that we're currently doing. We know that the biosphere is collapsing, and we know that we have to make this transition in the next 20 years, or we're screwed if we're not already. And because of that, we therefore have to have some very difficult conversations if we're going to put all of our energy and resource into building these renewable energy systems, rebuildable energy systems, sorry. We have to let go of some things that we currently might see as essential or required. So, for example, the military is a good example. You know, the US military is something like the 5th largest economy globally in terms of its energy and resource demand. And you know, if the US lost its military, then actually there'd be a whole load of energy and resources freed up for other purposes. The healthcare system is another one that has a huge demand for energy and resources. Again, you know, if we're going to try and build out these buildable energy systems, then actually maybe we have to let go of so much of the high-tech healthcare and accept that a higher death rate associated with reduced industrial acute health interventions might actually be more acceptable ethically in the short term than the longer term implications of continuing on the industrial path that we're on. The other question that I think is pertinent to this is the question of, okay, we build one generation of rebuildables. So we build out an entire global rebuildable renewable energy system, which is of the sort of scale of our current industrial fossil fuel powered system. In 20, 30, 40 years, that's all going to need replacing. Where is the resource and the energy to do that going to come from? So that's another really important question there.
Right. Okay, thank you. I'll now turn to questions from the participants, and I'll go in order. Yakal, would you like to put your questions directly to one of the speakers?
G'day all. Thank you very much, Nathan and Justin. That was a really fantastic presentation. My initial question to Justin, I think, was, I've lost it. I've lost it. I crashed out. But I think it was along the lines.
Are there truly sustainable energy technologies, or is it rather a question of scale, is what you stated?
Yeah. Thanks, Jack.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the authors really point out that you know, the only truly sustainable thing is you know, essentially wood, and something of that nature, which is not something that's going to support 9 billion people. But yeah, when you look at, yeah, well, the paper lays out the problems that make, you know, solar photovoltaics, wind, etc., not truly renewable at the moment, and you know, those are absolutely valid critiques.
Okay, another question here from Brent about energy requirements for extracting lithium from seawater.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so I couldn't answer that right now. I'm sorry, and it would certainly be not commercially viable right now. I mean, this was a paper that was published in the academic literature a month ago, so it's not going to be engineered yet. But I guess my point in showing this is just that, you know, there's a lot of new thinking happening and you know, searching for new solutions that are motivated by the types of problems that are laid out in this paper.
Okay, another question here. It's not clear who it's directed to, so anyone, either of you can comment. Given your views on renewable energy, what key points would you make to the Ministry for the Environment and Aotearoa's emissions reduction plan? Do you care to address that?
Sorry, I'm just looking at the question. Goodness. Do you have anything to say on that, Justin? Let me. Sorry, I just I'm just trolling. I find it difficult to listen to these questions sometimes. Could you repeat
it's
that?
it's at the 7.53 minute mark on
7:53.
the questions.
I don't think I don't
I
think
didn't
have
see that one, but I think I heard you. And was the question what would be our comment for the Ministry for the Environment?
Yes, regarding the new emissions reduction plan that's recently come out seeking public submissions.
Mm.
Right. Okay. Go ahead, Justin.
I mean, yeah, my view is that we've got to start now. I mean, you know, that if we wait for the perfect solution, then we're going to do a lot of damage in the meantime. And so, you know, I think that, you know, electrifying the grid, the grid is electrified, electrifying transport and industry, and looking at, you know, for example, the Lake Onslow electric battery project, you know, is being investigated as a way to so that this is where they're looking at using renewable energy to pump water uphill into a hydro jam to get around the dry year problem, and also get around the intermittency of renewables. That's something that geographically we've got the opportunity to do in New Zealand that you know, most other countries wouldn't be able to do, just because of the population density and the, you know, rivers and valleys we have. So I think the Ministry for the Environment, though, you know, a lot of their other work is actually on circular economy, and I don't see them linking those two things together, as I think they need to.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So can I speak to that question just briefly?
Go ahead, Nathan.
Yeah, which would say that it's very much questions that's at the heart of the Wise Response Society's reason for being, and the Wise Response Society has posed the question: as demand for growth exceeds its physical limits, causing unprecedented risks, what knowledge and changes do we need to secure New Zealand's future well-being? One of the key pieces of knowledge in our experience, that's Wise Response, of trying to engage with central and local government, actually all levels of government, and, you know, now getting on for 8-9 years worth of responding to consultations, is that the level of energy literacy across the ministries is actually exceedingly low, and particularly when it comes to this perspective that is based on biophysical resource depletion, and the way in which that is affecting our futures. The interesting part about it is when you accept that actually, you know, there is no future for industrial society, you know, never mind there is no alternative, and that the unpalatable things like population reduction and other things are supposedly off the table because we just can't think about those. But actually, you know, there is no alternative. What there is no alternative to is this fundamental reality that we're facing in terms of energy resource depletion, and the way that constrains economic activity going forwards. And when you look at the demand at the depletion curves, like that one from Krumdeck et al. That I had in my presentation, it's clear that actually we're going to be contracting our economic activity, because underlying all economic activity is energy expenditure. Every unit of GDP has energy expenditure associated with it, and if there's less gross energy available to us, particularly the third of New Zealand's energy that comes from petroleum products, for example, then that will be less GDP, and it's really that simple. And nowhere do I see in any of the consultation documents, in these emissions plans, etc., any sort of discussion of, you know, well, okay, we know we need to do this. Actually, we're going to be forced to by resource depletion as well. And that's good news from the environment's point of view, but it's bad news from, you know, the human economy point of view. And how do we balance those tensions, and how do we actually have these honest conversations? Can we have these honest conversations? You know, are we actually cognitively capable of it? And it's an open question. Again, you know, individually we can push into these things, push past the grief and anger and depression, which are natural responses to hearing about these things for the first time. But over time, you know, you start to get, and it's taken me 10 years, you know, before I'm confident to actually, you know, really start to speak publicly about this stuff, to really get to the point where I think, you know, that this is actually something that could be a positive for us, right? It is from an environmental point of view, and actually the government needs to listen to this perspective. It needs to start trying to incorporate it into policy making, and it needs to let go of some really, you know, sacred cows, for example, MB's energy modeling, which is all based on demand forecasting, completely ignorant of supply constraints and trends. So yeah, sorry, slightly wrong answer, but yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Nathan. I'll continue on with the questions from the group. Can Justin comment on the CO2 sequestration potential of olivine?
I'm afraid I can't. I'm not sure what that refers to.
Can I comment on that, Jack?
Sure, go ahead, Bunya.
Yeah, yeah. I've just been reading a bit recently about there's been some New Zealand work happening in this area with the potential for using calcium hydroxide, which can be refined from olivine, which is one of the a very large mineral components of our planet. But I was just interested if either speaker maybe was aware of this. I mean, the claims in the article I was reading were that, you know, it's got a much higher potential for sequestering carbon dioxide in a form that doesn't have to be pumped down into the earth for a start. And because it chemically binds with the calcium hydroxide, and it can be sequestered at about a ton of CO2 per ton of the mineral. So to me, straight away, it rings warning bells in that you know, a lot of these solutions sound really good, have potential, but it doesn't talk, for instance, about how much energy is required to process the olivine from, you know, the mine to a plant where it can be processed into a powder, which can then be used to sequester the CO2. So yeah, if either of you got any knowledge of that, I'd be interested in.
So just very quickly, global CO2 emissions are 7.35 gigatons. That's 7.35 million tons in 2021. That's from the IEA's Global Energy Review. So, you know, ton for ton, that's 7.35 million tons of olivine, the mineral that would be needed to sequester that carbon. That's a very, very big number. It's a very, very big energy input to mine and refine and process and transport that material. I just, you know, I don't think these things are scalable. You can demonstrate all kinds of CCS stuff in the lab. None of it is making sense commercially. All CCS plants are a parasitic energy load onto the generation plant, which reduces the effectiveness and the cost effectiveness of those plants. We've already got renewable energy for now, whilst you know, the inputs for the renewables remain relatively low, undercutting them on a levelized cost of energy basis. And I just don't think it's ever going to see anything other than, you know, theoretical papers of the sort that you're referring to. It just doesn't make any economic sense in the real world, and it doesn't scale.
Okay, thanks. We got another question here from Dave Bartle. Is to Justin. can you please elaborate on how quickly you think green steel and also new solar cell materials might develop? What other dynamic factors other than capital might influence the speed of change in terms of regulations and the influence of the emerging circular economies, if any?
Right. So as I mentioned the solar photovoltaics earlier, that there are companies starting to scale up manufacture of these, and the more you manufacture, the cheaper it becomes to manufacture, and the more competitive they would be expected to become. So that's kind of at an engineering phase now. And the green steel, that's in the lab scale and about to go more into the pilot plant scale. And things change once you scale up. And I think the external things beyond what you can demonstrate in the lab are, I don't know how many $1 million the Glenbrook steel mill costs, but it's a lot. And just replacing, a furnace and getting everything validated and changing a process is a big deal. So my colleague Chris Bumby is working with steel engineers on this, and they do see the need to work in this space, but it's not something that they're just going to buy off the shelf at next year. So it's replacing assets is a serious commitment, and I think that's probably the bigger constraint to work towards. There's a lot that you need to prove before they'll take the risk.
Mm-hmm. Hey, I note that we're coming to the end of the time that we've allotted, and I'd just like to make an observation about the. It occurs to me that many of these innovations may in fact be helpful, but it's not clear to me that they're going to be scalable in the time we need, and that we likely need to have a serious conversation about the alternatives. One has to do with that difficult issue of population. The Eye of the Needle article talks about voluntary population reduction. It's quite important to understand that. It's not a draconian kind of Chinese approach. The other point I wanted to make was that I was very encouraged, Justin, to see your reference to the Kate Rayworth's donut economy. But I also think it's important to point out that a donut economy and a circular economy are not the same things. A donut economy actually has physical limits as part of its essential conceptual framework. The circular economy doesn't. The circular economy is actually not a sustainable economy. It's an improvement on our existing linear economy for sure, but there are many papers that have addressed the lack of dealing with entropy, for example, and biophysical limits in a circular economy. And so it's not to be confused with the donut economy, which actually does recognize limits to growth. Anyway, this has been a very, very interesting discussion, and obviously there are many technical aspects to it. But it seems to me that we also need to step aside from the technical and ask the bigger questions about, what's the purpose of technology? What's the purpose of an economy? What do people need for a satisfying existence? And how do we get there? And we're not having that conversation. This is the closest I've come in a long time to it, so that feels good. I thank all of the presenters and the participants who've asked questions and suggested questions, many of which we have not been able to get to. But the items, again, this has been recorded. We will put a YouTube version of it up. It takes a day or two to do that. And the questions in the chat will be included. So people will be able to at least see what other people's questions were. And if anyone else cares to comment on them, they can either write to me and I'll try to get them out to everyone. And the video, by the way, will be accessible through the Nelson Tasman Climate Forum website. If you Google Nelson Tasman Climate Forum, we have an events section on that website, and that's where we'll put up the YouTube in a couple of days. So thank you once again for a very informative and interesting discussion. And let's keep the discussion going. I think it's an incredibly important one for all of us, and for if we want to be good ancestors, we have to struggle with this more than we have been. So thanks again, and I'll sign off and be well for the next session. Take care all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.